I don't know why it tells me that now. It never told me that before. I just got to secretly record before. Although you can tell because it's got the icon there. All right, here we go. So for Sunday, July 7th, or excuse me, it's July 4th, we are going to look at Nehemiah 8 and 9. And my message will technically start with the last half of verse 73 from chapter 7, which in my Bible is broken off to go along with chapter 8. And it may not be that way in yours, but that's the way it is in mine, because they put that together with it starts with it starts with when the 7th month came, the people of Israel being settled in their towns, all the people gathered together. So it broke it apart like that in my Bible. So I was like, well, it fits together, it's fine. Plus verse 1 in chapter 8 starts in the middle of a sentence, so it didn't make sense to not include that last half. So, but again, the translators of the NRSV made that choice, not I. So anyway, so what we're going to look at is how the people respond following the completion of the wall and the registration of the families there. That's the majority of chapter 7. And so we'll get going with that. So so chapter 8 opens with all the people gathering together in the 7th month. And so I will talk about this. I've already preached this message, but the 7th month in the Jewish calendar is very important, because that's when Jewish New Year is. It's also when the Day of Atonement is, and the festival of Sukkot, which is also known as the Festival of Booths or Tabernacles. And you can read about those in Leviticus 23 and around there to kind of get a further description of those particular festivals. But we'll go into a little bit of that today too. So remember that the wall was finished on the 25th day of the 6th month. So there's about 4 days of time that's passed since the finishing of the wall to the opening of chapter 8. And the people all gather in the square before the water gate, and they tell Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses. And so Ezra does, and he brings it before the assembly, both men and women and all who could hear with understanding. And he begins to read from it. And he's sorry. So he begins to read from it from early in the morning until midday, and he is standing on a wooden platform that had been made for this purpose. So he's elevated above the people so that they can see him reading, and they can hear him better from up there. And he has 13 people, 13 men up on the platform with him. Let's see, I want to make sure I get the numbers right. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on his right and 7 on his left. He reads it, and as he reads it and as he opens the book, the people stand up. And then Ezra blessed the Lord, and the people answered, Amen, Amen. They lift up their hands, and then they bow their heads and worship the Lord with their faces to the ground. Verse 7 lists 13 more people who are Levites, and they are specifically described as helping the people understand the law. So the idea is, at least the visual that I get, is that these Levites are sort of dispersed out amongst the crowd. so that as Ezra is reading, when he takes a pause or whatever, then they're able to help the people understand. So they begin to have these conversations. So verse 8, they read from the book, from the law of God with interpretation. They give the sense so that the people understood the reading. So there's this ongoing conversation throughout that all of the men and the women and everybody who can understand are having at this point. And I'll get to the I'll come back to the importance of that. So Nehemiah is the governor, Ezra is the priest and scribe, Levites taught all the people. And they say, this day is holy to the Lord your God, do not mourn or weep, for all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. So he says to them, go your way, eat the fat, drink the sweet wines, and portions of them to those who for whom nothing is prepared, for this day is holy to our Lord, and do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. So again, this is the first day of the 7th month, which is in the Jewish calendar. This is Rosh Hashanah. This is the New Year day. This is a festival day. It's not a day for weeping. It's not a day for mourning. It's a day for celebrating. So he's reminding them that that's what that day is. And so all the people went their way to eat and drink and send portions to make great rejoicing, because they had understood the words that were declared to them. So that's all on the first day of the 7th month. Again, Rosh Hashanah, New Year. The people, I think it's my estimation that Ezra and Nehemiah were paying attention to the construction project, and they saw that it looked like the 6th month, sometime during the 6th month, the project would be completed. And remember, Ezra came to Jerusalem about 12 years before Nehemiah got there. And he was specifically tasked with these worship reforms. So the temple had been rebuilt, and he came in to say, hey, this is how the Torah says we should worship, in this way, and not this way. And he went about that work. And so for 12 years, he had been working with these people about the reforms. And he more than likely had been, explaining the Torah and reading it to them and guiding them in worship, so that when it comes to this moment where the project, the wall is complete, and it happens to be right before the beginning of the 7th month, that the people go, wait a minute, the 7th month is important. Let's take advantage of this. And so notice that it's the people that call Ezra to read the Torah. So they understand already that, that the beginning of the year or the beginning of the Jewish calendar year, or the new year, is important. That first day of the year, they know that that's important. They know that there are other important things coming up, which we'll get to in a minute. But it's the people that push forward for it. And so again, Ezra and Nehemiah have been looking at the calendar and going, okay, if we're going to finish in the 6th month, and we want something to happen in this moment, they make preparations. So the wooden platform is constructed for the purpose of having Ezra elevated so that he could read in front of the people. Now, there's no mention in chapter 8 about Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, which happens on the 10th day of the 7th month. But Yom Kippur is one of the highest holy days in all of Judaism. It is the day when all Jews are supposed to make pilgrimage to Jerusalem to atone for to make sacrifices, to atone for their sins, whether they realize they've committed those sins or not. So Yom Kippur is one of those days that Jerusalem just floods with people, with Jewish people from all over the diaspora. I remember the most vivid picture I have of Yom Kippur is actually from the book Christ the Lord by Anne Rice of the vampire fame. She's a Roman Catholic, or at least she was at some point in time. And she wrote a book called Christ the Lord. And there's a scene in there where Jesus and his family go to Jerusalem on Yom Kippur. And she describes that there were so many sacrifices going on that the blood was running everywhere in the temple, and it was just kind of gross. But anyway, that's that's free of charge. Anyway, obviously it was a work of historical fiction. So, but Yom Kippur is a high holy day, and that's the 10th day of the 7th month. The 15th day of the 7th month begins the Festival of Booths, or the Festival of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, is how it is in Hebrew. And that's the festival that lasts 7 days. And it is a celebration and a remembrance of the fact that the people used to live in tents while they were wandering around. And so if you read Leviticus 23, you'll see that the people are instructed to construct these temporary shelters. It's another way to translate tabernacles and booths. So that, and then live in them for that week to remind themselves that they used to be a wandering people, that they used to live in a temporary housing, no matter how permanent their housing is now. So there's instructions here to go out to the hills and bring olive branches, myrtle, palm, and other leafy trees to make booths. There's when that Jewish virtual library website that I go to, there was some extra commentary on Sukkot and talking about in the construction of the booths or the shelters, that there was supposed to be enough gaps in the roof that that you could be able to see the stars through it. So it wasn't like watertight. So if it rained, you would get rained on, but you could see up. It wasn't meant to be like a waterproof kind of deal. It was meant to be out in the elements. It was meant to remind you of that time in the wilderness. So anyway, so they celebrate this festival, and it's a 7-day festival that has an 8th day attached to it, which is like the way that it's described is like you're having a I'm freezing. Hold on. Let's see. All right. If y'all can, I don't know if y'all can still hear me because y'all are frozen, which means I'm probably frozen to y'all. I'm gonna wait for just a second. Uh-oh. Okay. All right. Thank you. All right.
Welcome back.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Sorry about that. I was connected to the wrong section of our Wi-Fi in the house. So I was connected to the one that's farther away. And it was like, hey, not enough strength. So sorry about that. Please tell me what the last thing you heard me say was.
Oh, that was a long time ago.
The booths were not waterproof.
Yes, okay. That's a good spot to start.
Okay, very good. Yes, so the booths were not meant to be waterproof. They were meant to leave you in the elements so that you remembered and could sympathize with those who were in the wilderness during the time between the Exodus and the entry into the Promised Land. Um, so it was a 7-day festival that lasted from the 15th to the 22nd day of the 7th month. And there is an 8th day attached to it that is kind of like, the way that it's explained is that God has invited you to this week-long party, and he's like just not ready yet to let you go. So he invites you for one more day. And there is so there's an 8th day attached to it. It's actually a separate day. It's not part of the Feast of the Tabernacles, but there's this 8th day. And so that would be the 23rd. And then we get to the 24th day, which would be the next day after that. And that's the day that opens chapter 9. So we've got the Rosh Hashanah, we've got day 1, we've got Yom Kippur, which is day 10, and then the Festival of the Booths, which begins on the 15th and runs through the 22nd. Then there's the 8th day festival.
Is there anything special that goes on that 8th day?
No, it's just an extension of the.
Okay.
There was some wording on the Jewish Virtual Library .org website that said that if you like in Jerusalem, it's known as Simchat Torah, which is a celebration of a joy of the Torah. Outside of Jerusalem, that's separated into that. It's basically then that 9th day. There's a celebration of the 8th day, which is like a literal translation of what they call it in Hebrew. And then there's Simchat Torah, the joy of the Torah, which is the next day. So I don't know why it's different if you are in Jerusalem versus outside of Jerusalem, but and I don't really pretend to understand how all that how those calendars work either. So
I have 2 questions. One question was back in verse 4 in chapter 8. One of the men mentioned is Zechariah. Could that have been the Zechariah that wrote the book of the Bible? Zechariah?
Yes, I believe so. I believe that Zechariah was a post-exilic prophet, and he could have been that one. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of looked up, and he was in there around that time, but he was even earlier than Ezra. So I guess it depends on how old he was, if it was the same one.
Right. And again, even though those names look really uncommon to us, many of those are common names as well.
Name, yeah.
So it's, it may not be as common as like John or something like that today, but.
I had another question. I read with a note. I think it was in my Bible or another book that I was looking at. That when it said that when they were reading the law, that there was people that were explaining it to the and kind of interpreting it. The note said that it was possible that maybe the people that had come back, they really didn't understand Hebrew as well anymore. So if it was being read in Hebrew, that they needed to explain it to those that didn't remember Hebrew language anymore.
Right. So there's some, depending on, there's different scholars that wonder about the translation of that word, interpretation, whether that's translation, or whether it should be rendered as translation, where yes, people who've lived their entire lives in Babylon or Persia are returning to which, and they speak a completely different language, coming back into the Holy Land, they would have to refamiliarize themselves with Hebrew, or at least Aramaic. And so there may be some of that going on where those Levites and those who are out amongst the crowd would have to do some translating between the original language and the language of the people. So yes, I think there's some of that going on. it feels like there's also this level of it feels like um, what the those of you who teach Sunday school do on a week in week out basis is that we're reading the text, and then those who have studied it a little bit more are providing just that little bit more of insight towards what's going on in the text and what that means and what the implications are. So that's sort of the parallel that I draw in what's going on there, is that those 13 men who are out amongst the crowd are engaging in conversation and discussion with the men and the women and those who are able to understand. And it's almost like they're doing little small groups and little group discussions out there. And I make a point in the message to talk about how that happens at that there's no it's not like all the men go over here and all the women go over here and then the kids are off somewhere else. It's anybody who can understand comes, and even my take on it is that even those who didn't understand completely were still in the vicinity of what was going on, so they were absorbing something. They were hearing it read, they were hearing it explained, they were hearing it interpreted. And it's kind of like I look at it as when we have worship in person, we've got people of all ages and stages in their faith, from little bitty ones to folks with lots of life experience. And they hear the scriptures read, they hear the songs that we sing, and they hear the the message, and they hear the prayers, and they hear all of that, and they soak it in at whatever level they have the ability to do that. And so it's one of the I talked specifically about having kids in worship and saying that they may be like color, my littlest one, he may be coloring on the back of the bulletin, or leaning on Debbie's shoulder or whatever, but at some level he's hearing this and he's absorbing it to his level. And what I find fascinating is that oftentimes it's those moments that where a kid comes up and goes, "Hey, Pastor Dean, you said such and such. Can you say more about that?" And so I tell the story about Avon Trask and how that was his deal. Like, I knew he was dialed in, because pretty much every Sunday he would come up to me and he said, "Pastor Dean, you said this, and what about this and this and this?" And I'm like, man, he's paying attention. And it's those kind of moments where it's like, number one, I got to be really careful about what I say, and number two, I got to be ready for those kinds of things. So it's that kind of deal, I think, that's going on, is that in the midst of this worship that's happening, and they're reading the scriptures and it's being interpreted and they're having conversation. It's that back and forth that's allowing the understanding and the what eventually will become the application, because we'll see in chapter 9 the application of it, is that it's sinking in more deeply for them. So yes, that's
What's the difference in the 13 men mentioned in 4 and the 13 mentioned in 7 being different?
Right. It feels like the 13 in the crowd are specifically tasked to have those conversations. It seems that the 13 that are up on the platform with Ezra are either there to read when Ezra is tired, and it doesn't say he takes turns with them, but maybe that's them. Maybe it's they are different groups, but it's not entirely clear what the difference is.
Okay. That's fine.
But there's some overlap in the names, if I remember correctly. Maybe not. Maybe there's another group that they have overlap on.
Yeah, I'm not
No.
seeing,
No, I was trying to think. Maybe it was. Oh, it's in chapter 9 where there's some the guys who stand on the stairs.
oh, okay.
There's some overlap in a couple of names there. Again, I don't know why they're standing on the stairs. So.
Okay.
All right. So okay. All right. So they celebrate the festival of booths, and then on the 24th day of the month, the 7th month, which is the month of Tishri, if you need to know that, Tishri. Then the people are assembled with fasting and in sackcloth and with earth on their heads, and they are now responding to the Torah that has been read for them and the festivals that they have engaged in over the last 3 weeks, and so now they are coming to a point of confession, and they're doing so on a national scale. They're doing it on a whole people scale. They bring the book of the law back out, and it's read for a fourth of the part of the day, and for another fourth part of the day they make confession and worship the Lord their God. So if you the way that I described it in my message is that if you assume 12 hours of night and 12 hours of day, then a fourth of the day is 3 hours, and another fourth of the day is 3 more hours. So this worship service lasts 6 hours. 3 hours it's reading, 3 hours it's confession and worship. And so Ezra comes beginning in verse 6, and he recounts the story of the Israelite people beginning at creation. And it goes through all the things that God has done for them, and is not shy about telling the people that, God has been faithful and you have not. And, so all the way from creation to, and he starts with Abraham, go to Egypt and the Exodus, and giving of the law and the Torah, how they skipping down to like verse 16, our ancestors acted presumptuously, stiffened their necks, did not obey their commands, they refused to obey. But he says in this is the second part of verse 17, he says, but you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and you did not forsake them, even when they had cast an image of a calf for themselves and said, this is your God who brought you up out of Egypt, and had committed great blasphemies in your great mercies. In your great mercy did not forsake them in the wilderness. Pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. So just again, explaining, just going through and recounting all the ways that God has been faithful to occupy the land. Goes through the Judges period, beginning in around verse 26, 27, and talks about the Judges cycle, how they, they turned their back. You gave them into the hands of their enemies. They made them suffer. Then they cried out, and you heard them from heaven, gave them mercy. And then eventually that they were exiled. And so it's basically a recount of their entire history, with a little bit of here's what this means, Ezra's interpretation as he's recounting this to them. And the last verse of chapter 9 says, because of all this, we make a firm agreement in writing, and on that sealed document are inscribed the names of our officials, our Levites, and our priests. And so they go from, here's all the things that we've done wrong, not just themselves, but also the people of Israel. So they're confessing not only their own sins, but their ancestors' sins. And then they are making a covenant with God, and they're reaffirming that covenant right there at the end of chapter 9, which will technically be the lead-in for next week. But let's see. Okay. I want to go back to verse 2, because this is important for for what's happening. It says, my NRSV says, then those of Israelite descent separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their ancestors. So it's not that, so what that verse acknowledges is that there are people from outside the Jewish faith originally who have become part of the Jewish faith. But in this moment of national confession, this moment of confessing for all of their ancestors, those folks who are outside the Jewish faith don't have that ancestry. Their ancestry is somewhere else. And so they're not saying that the foreigners are bad or not included in Judaism. It's that in this moment of confession, they would be erroneous in confessing their ancestors' sins because their ancestors aren't Jewish. So they're separating themselves out so that they can confess, so that the Israelites can confess the sins of the Israelites and their ancestors. Again, it feels like that there's a separation, but that those foreigners are still watching what's happening and seeing what's going on, and looking at what that scene could be like. So, but they don't have, they can confess for their own sins, but they don't have to confess for the ancestors of Israelites' sins. Does that make sense? I hope so. Okay. All right. All right. What questions do y'all have about 9 and 10?
I just wanted, one of the studies I read was talked about with this prayer that if you look at it, the first part up to like verse 15 is talking about the God of Israel and what he did for the people, which, is like you said, going over the history. And then the next part, it talks about the forefathers and all that they did. And then the last part, when they get to about 32, and and if you look at it, all the talks about, it always says they and they, right. Talking about the ancestors, and then 32, and then they start talking about we. So they got back to the current time, and so what what they haven't done and what they need to do. Right.
Yeah. So it sort of nicely breaks into that. Here's what God did, here's what our ancestors did, and here's what we did. And so it takes that approach to it. It acknowledges their own wrongdoing, it acknowledges the wrongdoing of their ancestors, and it acknowledges the fact that God has been faithful through all of it. one of the, so verse, yeah, the second half of verse 17. I think I read that before. You are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and you do not forsake them. That's an almost direct quote from Exodus 34, 6 and 7, which is one of the most requoted verses in all of Scripture.
What was that?
I'm sorry, which one?
Exodus what?
Oh, it's Exodus 34, 6 and 7. It's quoted over and over again in the rest of Scripture, where God's is forgiving, gracious, merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. It appears all over the place, and it's it's tweaked based on the usage and context,
Circumstances.
yeah, that that the writer is quoting it into. So but again, it's Exodus 34 is 2 chapters after the golden calf, and the reestablishment of the Torah, or the Ten Commandments. So 32, Moses goes down, and he's disgusted, and he throws the tablets down, and then God calls him back up and says, let's do this again. And so that's where they originate. So there you go.
That the last verses in 9, like 36, where he talks about first, is this prayer done by Ezra? Because it isn't really clear. At first I thought it was, maybe some of the other priests that were doing the prayer, but are we to assume that Ezra's giving this prayer?
So back in verse 6, it says, at least in NRSV, it says, and Ezra said, but then there's no indication of any voice change at that point. So if you read that, and then it's Ezra speaking on behalf of the people.
Okay.
Throughout
Anyway,
the rest of chapter 9.
So anyway, it talks about that they were still slaves, slaves in their own land, even though they were on their own land. Right. Could you, go a little further and say not only were they slaves on their land, but they were also slaves to the sins that they committed, in their past, and the sins of their fathers? Right.
Which is, again, in the Jewish context, that's why they offer sacrifices, is to continually atone for those things. I mean, again, timing wise, they just had the Day of Atonement a couple weeks before this particular moment. So they're very much aware of their sins. I think it's interesting that they're having such a grand statement of confession, having just being 2 weeks removed from the Day of Atonement. But hour by hour, sometimes for me. Just saying.
At what point are they no longer in like vassals of the king of Babylon?
So as soon as they aren't, as soon as Cyrus in Persia comes and conquers the Babylonians, the Edict of Cyrus sets them free and allows them to come back to Jerusalem. So at that point, they are no longer slaves to Babylon. Now, not everybody came back right away. Because they had been in exile for 70 years. So basically, they were essentially 2 generations removed from being in Jerusalem. So there were a lot of people who had, who didn't know anything other than being in Babylon. And then folks like Nehemiah, who who had now really good jobs in Persia, didn't have, at least initially, an impetus to return because they didn't really know what was waiting for them there. So it wasn't until that burden was placed upon him that Nehemiah said he wanted to go back. So yeah.
Question 5 talks about, are there any Christian festivals that mirror the Festival of Tabernacles? Is there?
Not that I can remember, but I think it'd be kind of fun to,
Yeah.
set up a tent and live in a tent for a week and just kind of see what happens. I mean,
could we put that tent up in the sanctuary?
Maybe. I mean,
we could now.
Yeah.
Could now, yeah. They just worked around me now, so I went and did that. So.
And then question 10. Now that Nehemiah has helped the people rebuild the wall around Jerusalem and Ezra has helped the people confess their sins, what's next? Is the work complete now? Are the people truly ready to be the people of God that they were chosen to be? What's your thinking on why you should ask such a question?
Because I like to make your job hard. No,
yeah,
I'm kidding.
You're doing a good job at that.
Well, good. I'm glad. Got to keep you on your toes.
He asked that question the last lesson too. At the end, he said, "Is the work finished?" So it wasn't, because
it wasn't, right.
And now, so again, that the answer is no. The work is not complete yet. There's still more to come. And if you read ahead, you know what's coming.
Yeah. That whole, 2 weeks out from the Day of Atonement and I got to confess again. Guess what? Yeah. Chapter 13 is all about like, oh, they screwed it up already. Okay. Golly.
Okay.
We had such high hopes for them. But so does God. So does God have. God has high hopes for all of us. We will.
Well, that's just an ongoing thing. You have a revival, even in your own life where, you feel you kind of got this whole relationship with God going, and then you do something to screw it up and, you're back to confessing and starting at square one again. So I think that's an ongoing life of the Christian.
Right. Well, and I think one of the biggest hurdles that Christians in particular have is just the thought that, that we've arrived, that at some point you don't have to confess anymore. It's like, no, we're still human. Yes, we're forgiven, but confession is an ongoing part of the life of faith. And it's true for Judaism, it's true for Christianity. And so, and it's true for all of the individuals within those faiths. So there you go. Because whether we like it or not, Romans 6 is correct, that all fallen short of the glory of God. That's Romans 3. Sorry. But Romans 8 is also true, that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. That proves God's love for us. So there you go. All right. So what other questions? No?
That doesn't do me good to ask about future stuff. So
Hey, it's one of my big 3 goals this week to get that all squared away. So
the one answer to that question, are the people truly ready? And I had written down, I said, they think they are. You
Yep.
know,
Yeah.
at that moment they are,
Mhm.
but
Yeah,
we need to
kinda
find out.
like Dean said, hour to hour.
Mm.
So, um, again, I think it's one of those deals where those moments of, a big moment like this, act of confession here, sets, resets the system, and allows the people the opportunity to step into who God has called them to be, just like us. And and they're going to make it official with the covenant that they sign here in chapter 10. And then life happens. It's the same with us. It's like, I can,
Yeah, and
I can,
then George walks in the room,
oh, well,
He didn't.
And-
Don't worry about it, Gail.
Oh, you weren't using George in the generic term?
Well, of course.
Oh, goodness. Very good. All right. So yeah, well, appreciate y'all. Thanks for jumping on today. If you have any more questions between now and the lesson, your lessons for Sunday, then let me know. The new study guide for week 6 will drop on Friday. I'll send that to y'all, and then it'll go to everybody on Sunday again. So that'll be for chapters 10 and 11. And then we'll have the study guide for chapter 12 and 13 hit in 2 weeks. And then I've already decided, I know that for sure I'm going to come back to, Gary, you said you didn't know, you don't want to ask, but I know there's a couple of sections in this week's readings that I want to really unpack. Hold on. Yeah. I want to come back and spend some time in talking about I want to spend some time talking about the Festival of Tabernacles and Booths. So I'm going to come back to Nehemiah 8, and then I'm going to come back to Nehemiah 9, and that outline of the story of Israel, and how retelling our story helps us to understand better, who we are and what God has done for us, and reminds us that we need to continue to nurture that relationship. So I know that in an interim period between the official end of this series and being back in the building and kicking off the new series, I will spend time unpacking more of those 2 chapters. And so I know those are at least 2 weeks that we'll come back to, and I've got some ideas for a couple others as well. So I just don't know how many weeks I need at this point.
Yeah.
Because things are just still up in the air, and it's driving me crazy. So I just got to keep praying. And appreciate all y'all's prayers.
Something I saw made me stop and think, and it was so obvious after I read it and thought about it, and that is that there's something very close symmetry here between the quote unquote Exodus and the exile that's bringing everybody back now. Both of them had leaders that were bringing them back to the promised land. And I hadn't quite put my hand on that one before, but interesting thought.
Right. Very good. All righty. Well, again, I appreciate y'all. Let me know if you have any questions, and I hope y'all have a great rest of your week.
All right, thank you.
Have
Have
a
a
great
good
week.
weekend.
You're welcome. God bless.